Hello and welcome to the TNC or Transportation Network Company Driver Minimum Compensation Ordinance. This webinar will review the requirements of the ordinance and what drivers can expect. Very briefly, the ordinance requires that a TNC, also known as a rideshare company such as Uber and Lyft, pay drivers a minimum amount per trip and a minimum amount per mile and per minute for those trips. The first thing that we will cover is which drivers and which trips are covered by the ordinance and which must be paid according to the minimum per trip and per minute and per mile amounts. So the first category is all trips that begin and end in Seattle. If a trip begins and ends in Seattle, it must be paid according to the minimum payment requirements, which we will explain in a couple of minutes. The second category is a trip that begins in Seattle and ends outside of Seattle. For example, a trip from Seattle to SeaTac Airport. The entire trip in that circumstance is covered by the ordinance and must be paid according to the minimum per trip, minimum payment requirements. The third category is a trip that begins outside of Seattle and ends within Seattle. So, for example, a trip that begins at SeaTac Airport and ends in Seattle. That trip is only covered for the amount of time and distance that the driver spends traveling within Seattle. The portion outside of Seattle can be paid at whatever pay rate Uber and Lyft has established for that trip. And then the last thing I want to review very quickly is which TNCs, which rideshare companies are covered by this ordinance. A TNC is covered if they provide 200,000 trips in a quarter. Currently, there are only 2 TNCs that provide that number of trips in Seattle, and those are Uber and Lyft. So what is the minimum pay rate that is required by the TNC Minimum Compensation Ordinance? Drivers must be paid a minimum amount of 57 cents per minute plus $1.33 per mile. Note that in the first 3 months of this ordinance, the minimum per minute amount was lower because it was phased in. But going forward, it will be 57 cents per minute plus the $1.33 per mile. In some circumstances, and we will review that in a minute, a minimum amount of $5 must be paid on a trip. So when does the minimum per trip payment of $5 apply? It applies for completed trips if your per minute and per mile rate would have resulted in pay that was less than $5. So this is for particularly short trips where the per minute and per mile would only equate to, say, $3.50. Instead of being paid $3.50, you must be paid a minimum of $5 for that trip. It also applies to a trip that is canceled by the passenger or by Uber and Lyft. You must be paid a minimum of $5 for that trip. There's one exception if the passenger was not charged a cancellation fee due to some driver conduct reason. So if the passenger canceled the trip due to some sort of unsafe behavior of the driver or something of that nature, and Uber or Lyft refunds the passenger the cancellation fee, they are not required to pay the driver that minimum $5 payment. And the last category when a minimum $5 payment is required is when a passenger does not appear for the trip. So a passenger no-show, drivers should be paid a minimum $5 payment for that. The TNCs are required to provide drivers with certain information. There's 3 categories of information drivers can expect to receive. The first is a notice of rights. This is a short statement, a 1-page document that provides an overview of all of your rights under the TNC ordinance. It is provided by the TNCs directly, usually either in the app or on their website or via email. And it is also available on the Office of Labor Standards website, which the address is here on the PowerPoint screen. The second category of information is driver trip receipts. After each trip, the TNC must provide a trip receipt. There's a lot of information that must be provided, but I've highlighted here only the sort of top items to be aware of. There is additional information that must be provided, but the top items are the time in miles for each trip, the payment that the driver received, including tips and any deductions or charges that they took out of the payment, and finally the passenger fare. And the third category of information drivers must receive are weekly pay statements that covers all of the trips that the driver did in the past week. These statements must include the total time in miles, as well as the total pay, total tips, and total deductions. There's additional required information in these weekly pay statements, but this webinar is just going to highlight those top items to be aware of. One important tool that we want to make sure folks are familiar with is the driver pay calculator. This is a tool that is available on our website, and you can see the address there, www.seattle.gov/mayor/rideshare-calculator. This tool will allow you to take the miles and minutes that you see on your driver trip receipt and put them into this form to calculate how much you should have been paid on a particular trip and verify that your payment was correct. So we've provided an example here where you can see that this trip was 3 miles long and 12 minutes in duration. You should also enter when the trip occurred because the pay rates were different in the first 3 months of the year. So you can select when the trip was occurred and then click Calculate Pay. If you do that, a screen like this will appear, and you can see at the bottom that your payment should have been for this trip in April 2021, $10.83. One important thing to note about this calculator is that it will not display the correct rates if your trip began outside of Seattle. And that is because those trips are only covered for the portion within Seattle. And so you will not be able to get the correct rate. So use this calculator for trips that were entirely within Seattle or trips that began within Seattle and ended outside of Seattle. And finally, just to note on the calculator, this is for informational purposes only. It is possible that there may be deductions or other charges that would result in a slightly different pay, but this can be a helpful way to get a sense of whether you were paid correctly. I want to provide a little bit of information on additional protections within the ordinance, just to be aware of. The first one is that drivers have a right to receive all of the tip paid by a passenger. The TNCs cannot keep any portion of the tip and use it for any other purpose, including paying the minimum compensation rates. Tips must be in addition to the minimum payment required under the ordinance. The second thing is that if the TNC is taking any fees or charges or deductions out of your pay, those are only permitted if you have authorized them in writing ahead of time, and there cannot be a financial benefit to the TNC for those deductions. Thirdly, during the COVID-19 civil emergency, the TNCs must provide personal protective equipment or PPE. The requirement is that they provide a reasonable amount of masks, gloves, hand sanitizer, and disinfecting wipes or sprays. The TNC should also provide you with notice of where you can pick those items up and what hours and the location. Fourth, retaliation is illegal. If you believe you have been the victim of retaliation because you have asserted your rights under this ordinance, you should contact our office. And we can provide additional information on next steps. And finally, the rates that I have described in this ordinance will increase once a year on January 1st, and we will provide information about those rate increases prior to them becoming effective. That concludes the substantive portion of the webinar. If you have any questions, you can contact us on our website. The link is below, laborinquiry.seattle.gov/employee inquiry. You can send us a message through that link, or you can call our office at 206-256-5297. Interpretation is available, so please just let us know if you need those interpretation services. Thank you for attending.